Hi there, you've reached SJ Thomason with Christian-apologist.com, and I'm super glad you're here. We're going to do something very exciting today. We're going to review a debate, and I have with me some really exciting people. I've got Converse Contender and Craig Reed, and we're going to review the debate that's by Inspiring Philosophy and Matt Dillahunty that was last Sunday. So, whoops, hold on one second. Okay, so I've got President Donald Trump on my other thing. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So but without further ado, I want to go ahead and have Craig Reed and Converse Contender introduce themselves. And I understand Craig is walking to where he's going to be streaming from. So if we can start with Converse, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, sure. Am I audible?
You are.
All right, great. So my name is Converse Contender. A lot of people are going to know who I am, but just in case they don't, I'm a Christian. I've been on YouTube. I've been back on YouTube for a few months now, almost 3 months, I guess. And basically, I just just do debate reviews and have live discussions like the old school, like Google Hangout style live discussions that I'm used to. And basically just I also moderate for this channel that we're about to watch, Modern Day Debate. I'll be on there tonight moderating a debate between 3 people, which will be pretty interesting. So check it out if you want to.
Yeah, that's great. And Craig, are you ready to chat?
Almost ready, but I can introduce myself. Hi, my name is Craig Reed. I have a channel called Craig Reed TCR, short for the Christian Response. And you can find me on Twitter. And I've been doing this for about 2 years now, two and a half years, been doing my own little version of apologetics. And on my channel, I analyze debates. I put out videos all the time on whatever subject is related to what we're always talking about, and interview a lot of atheists. And that's about it.
Awesome.
Happy to be here.
All right. Well, thank you, Craig. And so now what we're going to do is we're actually going to review, because of time and how much time we have and the fact that Converse Contender is going to be leaving tonight to moderate another debate, as he mentioned. He goes and works with the Modern Day Debate. He's going to be talking about if porn is bad, and I'll go ahead and answer that and solve that whole debate. Yes, porn is really bad for society. So that you don't even need to debate. But anyway, so here we are right now. You can see here, James is in the middle. You see Inspiring Philosophy, who's also called Michael Jones. He's on the left, and pretty much everybody probably knows him. He has over 100,000 YouTube subscribers, which is really impressive. And Matt Dillahunty's on the right. And this is a follow-up debate. So these two had debated before, and we reviewed part of it. And we had decided that IP had won. And so, and of course, we are a little bit biased because we're Christians. So we have to try to take our bias away. Because actually last night, I would say with the Jim Majors debate that all of us watched a little bit with Darth Dawkins, I thought that Jim's very humble demeanor really bode well for him last night. I think a lot of times if you just look at a humble demeanor, I think that worked out pretty well for Jim. What do you guys think about that?
Well, yeah, I had the, go ahead, Greg.
You can go first.
So I actually had the after show on my channel, and I had Jim on and a lot of other atheists as well as Christians and just theists. And we had like I guess 2-hour after show talking about it. And it seemed that the majority of theists, Christians alike, thought that Jim kind of held it together better, and that my whole point about the debate last night was that I feel like Darth Dawkins, or he goes by multiple names, Duncan Atheism or whatever. I feel like if he were to just be more charitable in his approach, that he might actually have a really solid approach, like argument or apologetic. But it's the way that you carry yourself sometimes. It's the approach that makes or breaks the debate a lot of times. So
Yeah, I totally agree. I didn't watch I just realized that he debated Shannon. I didn't realize Duncan Atheism was Darth Dawkins until last night, actually. And I haven't had a chance to watch the debate. I just watched the beginning. But yeah, I totally agree. The presuppositional argument is actually kind of interesting from a philosophical point. It doesn't quite prove God because it's presupposing God, but they could do a lot better job, particularly him, of like, he just kind of, that was one of the weakest of him so far. He just kind of said, God exists,
Yeah. Hey, you
And you
still
don't
have
know
that
anything.
clicking, Craig, you still have that clicking noise.
Yeah, I'm not quite there yet.
Quite a bit. Okay.
I'm not where I'm going. I'm just interjecting. You can probably hear the forest now, right?
Well, I don't hear that. I don't hear the
I
cars
go
anymore.
hide in the
so-
woods.
He's hiding in the woods. Yeah, you better be safe. I hope you have some sort of protection.
Yeah, because I just ducked into the woods. I found a little alcove in the forest across the street from my apartment, about a minute down the road.
So if anyone's watching this and they're walking around in a forest in California, beware. Craig might be there lurking about.
Okay, now,
Okay.
now I'm parked. I'm sitting down.
Okay, awesome.
That was Darth. So far, I only watched the opening statements in about 5 minutes into it. And yeah, so far it doesn't look like that's Darth at his best. The argument itself is actually a lot more interesting than how it gets presented by these guys.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think he does have pretty good content. Now I have to admit, I got in an argument with Darth Dawkins once because he's a young Earth creationist, and he sort of had me cornered on a Discord channel, and Brett Keene's Discord channel. And it was funny because that's how Kyle Curtis discovered me. He listened to my conversation with Darth Dawkins, and so. But actually, I've had other interactions with him. He seems like he's a pretty nice guy, but it doesn't come across that way sometimes in debates. So you can't tell sometimes if someone's a nice guy or a nice girl.
right. Well, he in this debate so far, he had his opening statement was like, God exists. You kind of know that he does. And Jim started, and he just sort of turned it into corner the atheist. The first 5 minutes I'm watching, it's just corner the atheist and make him ask all the questions. Make him answer questions.
I think that I think there is a place for the presuppositional argument, but along with evidentialism. By that, I mean that I think that everybody realizes they have certain presuppositions before we even start the argument. And so to point those out may be a good starting point. But then I think that you need to move into the arguments themselves, though. And the other thing is that, when we're supposed to give a reason, right, with gentleness and respect, or gentleness and kindness, or however you want to say it, I think we should, I think the point of that wasn't just the reason, right? I think it was, the gentleness and kindness thing as well. That kind of makes the verse, is that whole point.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
It always is.
Yeah, I let's
watch how let's go ahead and start this video. Let's watch how IP starts off. So he's going to start off because obviously he's in the affirmative. He thinks God does exist. And we had predicted last time that he was going to use some sort of scientific argument. So I'm not going to give it away, but let's go ahead and see what he does. You ready? Here we go.
All right. Well, I've been looking forward to this debate for some time now, and I'd like to thank Matt for agreeing to discuss the topic tonight, because I've been following Matt for years. I've seen numerous of your debates, and I've had a lot of respect for your debate skills, the charisma, and your patience you display for some of your opponents. So I appreciate the honor to engage with you again. So diving right in, I'll start by noting I call myself a classical apologist. So that means I'll be arguing a theistic or deistic worldview is more probable, given the evidence, than a non-theistic worldview. So I don't claim I can prove God exists, and I won't be arguing specifically for Christianity. I'll be arguing for basic theism, and I'll present 3 arguments. First, by God, I simply mean a necessary and immaterial mind that created the universe, and so there's no need to argue for anything beyond that at this point. So the first argument I'll present is something called the emergent universe, or digital physics argument. Let's begin with the data. In several of my videos, I've presented various lines of evidence that space-time, our universe, is emergent and not fundamental. In the hunt to rectify quantum mechanics with relativity, physicists discovered something known as the holographic principle. A theory which suggests the entire 3-dimensional universe can be seen as 2-dimensional information. In other words, the whole 3-dimensional universe, the particles that make up reality, would emerge from underlying information in quantum field theory. In 2017, a peer-reviewed study published observable evidence for the holographic principle. From looking at irregularities in the background radiation, their team found that simple equations of quantum field theory could explain almost all cosmological observations, is marginally a better fit than the standard model, and could potentially explain apparent anomalies. Another study from last year found evidence of non-locality, even when 2 particles are not directly entangled. Thus, as the slide is meant to show, what this means is the information between particles is not affected by space, as it can be transferred instantly. So to sum up the implications, I'll quote Sean Carroll. Space is obviously not fundamental. Space is something when you go from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics, space more or less disappears. This implies space is not fundamental for the underlying world of quantum mechanics, but an emergent phenomena of the classical world that only exists after measurement. So the evidence implies all of space-time is emergent. Now, I could argue the emergent nature of matter or space-time from numerous areas, be it quantum mechanics, holographic principle, Brian Whitworth's features of a virtual reality, or in many other ways. But the idea space-time is emergent and not fundamental is accepted more and more by physicists every day. For example, physicist Hyeon-Seok Yang says emergent space-time is the new fundamental paradigm for quantum gravity. Thus, the most up-to-date evidence suggests all of what we experience, space, time, and matter, all seem to be emergent constructs of the classical world, not fundamental aspects of reality. But of course, the question becomes, from what does space-time emerge from, and how does this relate to God? I'm sure Matt would say something like, even if the universe is emergent, that doesn't mean it comes from a God. Well, essentially, the classical world emerges from the underlying information, or the universal wave function of the quantum realm. However, interestingly enough, these same underlying features have been seen to parallel aspects of the mind or mental thought processes. So in 2009, physicist Dietrich Ertz published a paper noting that our cognitive processes can be readily modeled using the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics. In other words, our inner mental world of thoughts, qualia, dreams, and emotions can be modeled in terms of quantum processes, the same processes we just discussed that have been shown to give rise to space-time and matter. So space-time and matter are emergent from the quantum wave function within Hilbert space, a spaceless non-physical reality, and our inner world of consciousness and mind can be modeled via quantum processes through the study of quantum cognition. So this would suggest the evidence implies that what space-time emerges from would be similar or indistinguishable from the same properties of a mind. So if what the universe emerges from resembles a mind, it is far more parsimonious and plausible to suggest it resembles a mind because it likely is a mind. This is also backed by the recent work of astrophysicist Franco Vazza and neurosurgeon Alberto Felitti, who wrote an article on the similarities between neural networks and the cosmic web of galaxies. There they show the properties of neural networks are similar to the cosmic web of galaxies, which is something we would expect if it's emergent from a mind. So thus, the argument can run as follows. So emergent universes exist in either a computer or a mind. Premise 2, the universe is an emergent universe. I think from the data I just went over, this is a logical conclusion. Premise 3, an emergent universe on a computer would still emerge from a mind. Okay, this follows from the fact that computers require atoms to exist. They are physical constructs. And so even if our universe was just a computer simulation, that computer would require a physical universe to exist in. And so we would still have the issue of what the physical universe emerged from. So computers that create digital universes still need a universe to exist in. So to break the infinite regress, we ultimately have to appeal to a spaceless, timeless entity. And since what we have just shown, the underlying quantum world mimics the properties of a mind, it seems reasonable to refer that it is likely a mind. So premise 4, the universe is emergent from a mind. And again, I would argue this is more likely given the data we just went over and the parallels found in quantum cognition. Thus, this mind is what we call God. Now notice, God is just a title for the underlying reality from which the universe emerges from. Therefore, God exists.
Okay, who wants to comment? You guys want to? Well, here's.
I guess I could start.
Okay.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, so we had guessed that he was going to do science. Obviously, this is science. He took an approach that would be something that even a deist could buy, because it's the idea that there's a God. We're not naming the God. We didn't say it's a Christian God or anything like that. But I think the idea of saying that it's kind of like a mind before matter idea. And so one would say that mind comes before matter, and particles and waves all emerge from a mind. And a lot of the composition of the universe from quantum theory is similar to that of a mind. So I think he made a pretty strong argument that way.
I tend to agree. The problem with the argument as he presented it here, because he presented similar arguments in his channel and his digital physics section, this was really hard to follow if you don't know the physics, and I don't really know the physics. So I'm not sure if it was quite fair to Matt to completely talk over his head, and we got to assume that everything he's saying is correct. Now, the underlying principle is fairly strong, And it's not necessarily something we have to argue because physics will either bear it out or not. And it seems like physics is heading in the direction where, you know, since like the 30s, there's been the underlying theological implications of quantum physics are kind of obvious. They kind of hint at either a cosmic consciousness or, you know, but in terms of this particular debate, his presentation right there, I'm not fully sure that, like, I like what he did, like how he's presenting it as in the conversation that they had on Skylar Fiction's channel, which I watched the first half hour. There was some really sharp girl, Shauna, who is a deist. And she pointed out that this was basically an argument for generic God, not specifically Christian God. And that's what the physics, that's the only thing that the physics would be able to support. And the argument is actually 70% of the way there towards a really good, strong argument. But this particular presentation is a little bit hard to parse out exactly what he means. That's what I found in the beginning. I don't know. Go ahead.
Yeah, Travis Lee is commenting. I want to add what he just said. So he said the argument is that the universe is a 3D projection from 2D quantum information processing, quantum entanglement. So, and that is the argument. That was the initial thing that he started with in that argument. And then he built on that in this idea with I want to add, this is similar to it reminds me, at least in a way, of the double slit experiment. And the double slit is an experiment that was referred to in a book by Robert Lanza called Biocentrism. And it makes a really good case for the need for a presence of an observer when we have these activities with small particles and waves. And so the double slit experiment's been used a number of different times, and it doesn't work the same way if the observer isn't present.
Right.
It's really interesting.
Right. And that right there, that idea that the phenomenon doesn't fully materialize unless it's being observed is an actual principle of quantum mechanics. Now, I'm not well versed enough in quantum mechanics to be able to tell you that that's case closed true. If somebody argued against me on that, you know, and they knew quantum mechanics, but that idea has really, really obvious theological implications. You know, if that's in fact the truth of the physics, and it seems like that's the truth of the physics.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. So I guess what I would say about this is, I do like the classical approach. He takes a classical apologetic, which basically just means that he's approaching this as someone who is going to argue to God first, as he put it. How can you? I don't remember if he just said it or if he's going to say it, but I think he did just say, like, how can you believe in my God unless you believe in that there is a God first, right? Or something along those lines. So in that sense, he's like Craig and Lennox and others who take that classical approach. And the book of Hebrews even says in chapter 11 something like, and anyone who comes to God must first believe that he exists, right? I mean, it makes sense. So I like that he's leading with that, because so that kind of handles that critique from whoever said that he's just basically arguing for a generic God.
right.
But I think, Craig, that may be a fair assessment, what you said. I think that perhaps this digital physics argument is a little above most people's head. Like, I think we actually said it in the last discussion that he might bring the digital physics.
I guessed
argument.
that I was hoping he'd bring it, but I was kind of hoping he'd see. One of the things that Dr. Josh offered in Skylar's critique, which I thought is that I'm not a physicist, and very few people who are floating around in these channels are. So we can't really check his work. We got to just assume that he's telling us everything that's correct. And this argument is a little bit over the head of the layman. I was hoping he would parse it down to purely layman's terms. I don't know how Matt Dillahunty is going to counter this. I don't know what I'd say. You know,
well, here's the thing.
Got any evidence? You know?
Right. Well, here's the thing. Like, Matt does.
Oh, just one thing real quick before I forget.
Go ahead. Yeah.
The Hebrews quote, "He who comes to God must believe that he is, and he is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him." That's what you're referring to, right?
Yes. And so, yeah, that's the one I was referring
Go
to.
ahead.
And so, but yeah, so Matt is going to try here in a minute to try and critique that. But basically, I'm not sure if he does it in his opening or in his rebuttal, but basically he tries to point out some obscure difference in the wave function collapse, but he's not studied enough on it to to know better. So IP actually comes back and goes, well, that actually doesn't work. And but I'm not sure if we're going to actually get to the rebuttals or not. But I just want to say that I thought Matt did a lot better in this discussion. It may have just been because he was more prepared. Maybe it was because they were in his studio. I'm not sure, but he did seem to be interacting with IP, and then IP was being really friendly. I mean, you know, it was a good exchange. So
Yeah, I agree with you. And
Yeah,
I think
it was definitely a friendly exchange.
I agree that with a couple of the points, that a lot of the points that IP did make
Go
did
ahead.
go over some people's heads. I could tell that by even just looking at the chat. There was some confusion there, but his approach, see, people can take either a deductive approach or an inductive approach or an abductive approach. And he took, if you go from general to specific, like going from God to then Jesus, you're taking that deductive approach. If you go from specific Jesus to general, you'd be doing an inductive. Or if you want to figure out if the best explanation for something, you go to the abductive approach. And so any of them can be used to bring a case for God. But I think it's interesting going this way. This is the C.S. Lewis Mere Christianity approach, the deductive approach, starting from the general and going more specific.
Right. And the thing about this particular type of debate, and this will probably become more apparent going forward, but why I was hoping he would chisel it down to layman's terms is because, as far as my understanding, so there's no why an atheist would be arguing the contrary, because the implications are there. And someone like Matt Dillahunty, like kind of how he had no place to argue from in the sociological utility of religion debate, eventually I don't think you're going to have a way to argue out of the theological implications of quantum physics debate. I really don't, because you're basically arguing against the science. The science, you can say, okay, I still don't believe in God, but the science is starting to indicate that there is some sort of mind-like quality to the universe. That's what the scientists say.
We're kind of losing you a little bit, Craig.
The Christians, you didn't hear that?
No, I
Can
did
you
hear,
hear
but I can hear you now. Now you're kind of going in and out a little bit.
Okay.
You're buffering just a little bit.
Well, all I'm saying is, in general, assume the science behind quantum physics is starting to have real theological implications. It's going to be harder and harder for someone like Matt Dillahunty to argue against them, because there seems to be a mind-like quality to the universe. That's what the science is saying.
Yeah, another thing that he did that I liked was he used Sean Carroll, which is one of an atheist, but one of the favorites of a lot of atheist debaters and just intellectuals in general. So he used him to make the points about space-time being emergent and so forth. And so I guess he used that to back his second premise, which is the universe is an emergent. The universe is an emergent universe. And so I like the fact that he did that, because if he were to have cited Peter Van Inwagen or some theist philosopher or physicist, or even a cosmologist, I think that it may not have been as impactful. So I just thought that was another good move.
Yeah. So okay, so I'm going to go ahead and shift us to the next part of this. I think we'll get. I don't remember if he's going to continue on or if we see some of Matt's feedback, Matt's opening statement. So let's go.
The second argument I would like to present is called the cosmic conscious argument, named from Eugene Wigner's work. So contingent minds either have a personal explanation or a natural explanation. This is not too controversial. Almost all theories of mind either hold to reductionist type views or believe consciousness is irreducible as is. It would have to come from a fundamental conscious source. So premise 2, quantum mechanics and other fields of science imply the natural universe is emergent from information processing and consciousness. Most controversial premise. But this could be argued from the data I just went over to support the digital physics argument. And I've argued this more extensively in my videos, obviously. But essentially, numerous experiments in quantum mechanics does suggest consciousness does play an important role in wave function collapse and the appearance of material reality. We get more into this later in the discussion section, but essentially experiments such as interaction-free experiments, delayed choice quantum eraser experiments, the violation of the Leggett inequality, confirmation of the Cauchy-Spector theorem, lead to the inference consciousness does in fact cause collapse. Here's an interesting study from just last year that, without getting into too much detail, they argued this result lends considerable strengths to interpretations of quantum theory already set in an observer-dependent framework and demands for revision of those which are not. So the observer does seem to play a role in quantum processes. Now, the number one objection I get on this is that interaction or decoherence alone is enough to explain wave function collapse. But this is a popular misconception. Does decoherence solve the measurement problem? Clearly not. What decoherence tells us is that certain objects appear classical when they are observed, but what is an observation? At some stage, we still have to apply the usual probability rules of quantum theory. Maximilian Schlauhauser says, decoherence arises from a direct application of the quantum mechanical formalism to a description of the interaction of a physical system with its environment. By itself, decoherence is therefore neither an interpretation nor a modification of quantum mechanics. And of course, we have observed collapse in experiments without interaction taking place. Thus, as John von Neumann, Henry Stapp, Fred Kuttner, Bruce Rosenblum, Bernard Hasch, Richard Cohn-Henry, Stephen Barr, Ian Squires all argue this philosophically leads to the conclusion that consciousness ultimately causes collapse. Notice I'm relying on physicists here. So it follows the appearance of the material reality as emergent from consciousness, not the other way around. Thus, conclusion 1, the natural universe cannot be the explanation of contingent minds, since the material reality emerges from consciousness. My third argument will support this as well. Premise 3, the explanation of the existence of conscious minds is personal. This personal source is what we call God, and therefore God exists. So unless Matt can demonstrate consciousness is emergent from the brain, and trust me, I'm willing to go over several studies in neuroscience as I've done on my channel, the most likely explanation is consciousness is irreducible and thus grounded in a personal source. This is also supported by philosophical arguments like indivisibility of personhood, unified visual perceptions, and the irreducibility of consciousness. Now, Matt is obviously aware of the hard problem of consciousness and recognizes there isn't a sufficient materialistic explanation for this. On the Atheist Experience, July 28, 2019, in response to a caller named Noah, Matt said, I'm personally of the view that consciousness is something that is the product of a brain. But let's say we have no explanation for it. Then we are in a position where we have no explanation, and that doesn't mean you get to claim that a deistic or pandeistic view is somehow likely just because you think that it offers an explanation for something for which we don't have an explanation. Now, sorry, but this is not really a good response to the argument from consciousness. If there is no materialistic explanation for consciousness, that doesn't mean someone can ad hoc exclaim we cannot offer other explanations for consciousness. Materialists do not have a monopoly on explanations, and all other alternatives have to be dismissed. And the fact is, from a priori reasoning about our own consciousness, as well as data from neuroscience and quantum mechanics, the evidence suggests consciousness is irreducible, which is why materialism suffers from the hard problem to begin with. As William James said, matter is not that which creates consciousness, it is that which limits consciousness. Thus, contingent minds, like ourselves, would likely be contingent on some sort of larger consciousness, so to speak, that controls reality and brings other contingent minds into existence, and who we call God. And once again, God is just a title for the mind behind the universe. Finally, I was planning originally to present a moral argument,
before we go
but I
on?
feel that topic deserves its own conversation.
Yeah,
So I'll supplement these two arguments.
there we go.
So that part right there, I wish he had clarified. I wish that were a little clearer, because that's the beginning of a really, really, really strong argument, the cosmic conscious argument. He has a version of it on his channel. It's not quite fleshed out correctly here, but there's what I was trying to say is there's really no reason why an atheist would object or argue against this, because the implication of quantum physics is, there seems to be irreducibility of consciousness. Okay, that
You're kind of you're buffering a little bit.
I know Matt, the arguments hold up. And then, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Yeah, just
Okay,
make sure.
so the irreducibility of consciousness is a really strong argument that Matt has argued against in other videos. And then he ties that into cosmic consciousness argument, which I wish he had fleshed out a little better, because it's actually almost a really strong argument that there's really no good reason why an atheist would necessarily object to, because it's basically rooted in the actual physics. You know what I'm saying? So I just wish he had chiseled it out better in this particular version. I wish he'd stuck to this, because it's almost strong. It's almost strong. Like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You know what I'm saying? Go ahead.
Yeah.
I just wanted to interrupt before
No,
I
I think
forgot.
that's good. I want to say Steven Steen did a super chat, and he said, and thank you, Steven Steen, and he said that he thought IP won, but he didn't think it was his best work. So I wanted to.
No, definitely not. It could have been because he dropped out, and this was a little bit hard to parse out, and it wasn't quite clear. But there's a strong argument buried in here that's potentially, game changing. I think it's just not quite there yet.
Yeah, so there was two things that came to my mind there. One is he used a phrase that I use all the time, where he says God is a title. I use that all the time. I say God's not a name, it's a title, because a lot of times people just unaware or unconsciously use God as a name. And so, for example, in my debate on the Trinity, on modern day debate, that's what I said. I said, well, God's not a name, God's a title, right? And so I thought that was an interesting thing that he said. But also, like, leading up to this discussion, we've heard so much about who won the debate, and nobody wins debates and things like this. Like, it's to simplify it, like, who did better? I mean, like, that's all we're looking for is like, who did better? Like last night, we're not just totally biased. Like last night with the discussion with Darth or Duncan atheism, like we thought that he did not do as well. So we might say that Jim won, but we don't mean win in that sense. We just mean that IP did better. I just want to point that out.
Yeah, Jim definitely did better in what I saw so far.
I better change my title then. Who did
That's
better
why I was clarifying, because people think, they're like, well, nobody wins debates, and I'm like, well, what we mean by that is just that who did better, right? That's who won. So.
Yeah, good point. And I want to point out this whole idea with consciousness. It's a very, very difficult subject, and it's difficult to a lot of people because we're trying to figure out how consciousness emerged. And if you look at the way that the planet came about, basically everything started from unconscious life forms to conscious life forms. And the question is, where did this consciousness or this sentience arrive from? Or an awareness is another way to look at it. So when did beings started being aware of themselves? And with persons, we're self-aware. We look in mirrors. Other animals can't see themselves when they don't understand what they're seeing when they look in a mirror, for example. And so there's a certain self-awareness. And the question is, if we have this mind where we're aware, where did this awareness arise? And the question is, when the universe came about and all of this matter started, was there an awareness at that point? And that's where the mind
and
is
the physics, the actual quantum physics tend to imply that the mind-like quality of the universe. That's why this argument needs to be chiseled out really strongly, because as far as my understanding is, the physics itself backs up, godlike attributes of the universe itself.
And one more thing here, I was seeing in the chat, Brenda saying that none of what IP's saying is true. And then right after Brenda said that, IP cited like 5 to 6 sources and goes, now keep in mind, I'm relying on physicists for this. Like, as soon as I read that, that's exactly what he said. So it was kind of serendipitous the way that it followed like that.
In the chat that night or chat today?
just now in the chat.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And I want to say thank you to everybody who's in the chat. If you want to ask a question of anyone, if you tag me, I'll be able to see it. And I just saw that Brian Stevens also commented that he felt that this was a pretty even debate. And so he had that opinion. And so some people might feel that way. So we'll have to keep playing it. You guys ready to keep going?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, here we go.
With the introspective argument. So premise 1, the mind exists. So no one with a mind can doubt this. This isn't really too controversial. Premise 2, the properties of the mind are not that which matter can have. So far, there is no evidence or theory which can show how consciousness or mental properties can reduce to matter. So John Sear says, how does a mental reality, a world of consciousness, intentionality, and other mental phenomena fit into a world consisting entirely of physical particles in fields of force. Colin McGuinn says the problem with materialism is that it tries to construct the mind out of properties that refuse to add up to mentality. There is simply no evidence consciousness can emerge from matter. All neuroscience can show at best is correlation, not causation. However, the properties of matter that we experience can easily be reduced to mind. Since all of what we experience is a world of qualia, taste, sounds, etc., see, we essentially experience a mental reality. So there's no reason to posit a discrete material world beyond what we experience. Keith Ward says it like this. Any physicist will say that brains are mostly empty space, in which molecules, atoms, electrons, and quarks, and other strange particles buzz about in complicated ways. It seems as though physical objects, when not being observed, have no colors and no sounds, smells, or tastes either. Sounds, like colors, are not physical events. Neither are smells, tastes, or sensations. Things do not smell like, taste like, or feel like anything when nobody is smelling, tasting, or feeling them. The physical world, it seems, is totally vacuous. No colors, smells, sounds, tastes, or sensations. What on earth is left? Second, two neuroscientists also recently argued space and the rate of time we experience or just emerge in models of the mind, again correlating with this idealistic worldview. Thus, the first conclusion is mind is not reducible to matter. And then premise 3, substance dualism is unnecessary. So Matt, from what I gather, agrees with me on this, so I don't have to worry too much. I could argue this from Spinoza's interaction problem, but conclusion, all is mind. If all is mind, this correlates with the previous two arguments that there is a governing mind that brings us contingent minds limited in matter into existence and experience and operating reality. Finally, I want to remind people tonight, the debate is, are there good reasons to believe God exists? Now, I've presented several reasons to conclude yes. I've also presented nothing I've not presented on my channel. If Matt doesn't think these are good reasons, he must tear down these by offering better explanations for the data I've presented tonight. He probably is personally not convinced, and I would expect that. He's welcome to believe whatever he wants. But that is not an objective case against the reasons I've presented tonight. Instead, if he wishes to argue there are no good reasons to believe in God, or that he's not sure, he must account for this data with a more plausible and parsimonious explanation. I will contend any attempt will either not be plausible or parsimonious. So in conclusion, theism is more parsimonious, more plausible, and therefore more probable. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you very much, Michael, for that opening statement.
So should we comment on this at this point?
Yeah.
Only to say that James is looking sharp.
Well, you know what? With both of those two are both in a suit. So I think that always makes people look pretty sharp. And so those two had a little bit of an advantage over Matt if the people were judging their fancy dress.
The third leg that he said, that's actually, again, that's almost really strong. I mean, the irreducibility of consciousness, that you can't derive consciousness from matter, seems to imply that the universe is all mind, or some aspect of the universe that is mind-like. It's kind of going back over the same ground, but in a better way. And there's really no reason why an atheist should object to that. They might say, yeah, okay, I don't believe in God. And they kind of presented it like that. Okay, I don't expect Matt to go, hallelujah, I'm saved. But the physics tend to imply some sort of mind-like quality to the universe. I think it's almost a great argument. It's almost there.
I want to comment that Brian Stevens says James bench pressed the whole audience after the show.
Word.
He said James bench pressed everybody.
Yeah,
you know,
James is
James
always
is
looking
trying he's trying to organize a trip down to Tampa. Did I tell you that?
No,
I put him
don't.
in contact with our crew contact over at my university, and so I'm hoping he works something out, because I will definitely attend if he comes down here and brings a whole bunch of people, like a couple debaters, all these people back. I'll definitely be
I'm
there.
actually
Taking
planning
photos
on
and videos.
I'm actually planning on going to Florida this year for my honeymoon.
Oh,
So,
Oh,
congratulations!
cool.
yeah, so I'm not sure when, but I'll be getting married in August, so I guess right after that sometime. So if it were where I could make it, that'd be awesome.
Oh yeah,
Wow.
that'd be really neat. Yeah, in fact, if he's, and the other one who's going to come down here, Braxton Hunter is going to be down here in March. And I don't know exactly when in March, but he's going to be in Sarasota, which is near me. And so I'm going to find him. As long as he doesn't go the one time I'm in Colorado, I'm going skiing in March. And so as long as he's not here then, I will be hunting him down.
Yeah, I will find you.
I know. Well, he told me he wanted me to join wherever he's going. So we'll see how that works out. So, okay, so here we go. Let's listen to what Matt has to say.
And now we'll be switching over to give Matt a chance to make his opening statement. So I'm resetting the clock for 15 minutes. And Matt, thanks so much. The floor is yours.
Sure. If you can just let me know when I've got like a minute left to I didn't time this out.
You bet.
So first of all, thanks for setting this up, and thanks to you for showing up and presenting that. I don't have any slides. I'm not going to be quoting anybody, and I'm not going to be, well, doing what I'm told I must do. One of the curious things in a lot of these debates is that people will present their case and say that, therefore, this is a good reason or this is probable. And in order for me to, in order for my opponent to win, they must present a more plausible explanation. Well, that's flatly wrong. If the claim is there are good reasons to believe in God, I don't have to come up with better reasons to not believe in a God, or I don't have to come up with better explanations for something, because if there's a mystery in the world and the correct position is that we don't yet have compelling evidence to say that we have come to a good evidence-based conclusion on that, then that is the conclusion. And we are stuck in the position of, I don't have to have an explanation for something in order to be able to say that, hey, you presented something, but it's not quite there yet. As if we come across a murdered body and you have this, you put together a case for the butler is the one that killed them. It's not up to me to come up with a more plausible potential killer. It is only up to me to say either you have made a good case for the butler did it, or you have not made a good case for the butler did it, and here's why. When we talk about are there good reasons to believe something, it is a sticky topic. Because ultimately, you either are convinced or you're not. And becoming convinced is the result of not a conscious decision on your part. I'm going to just choose to believe this. You make choices and you make decisions as an agent, but you're not just saying, I am now convinced. It is something that you're compelled to do by the weight of the evidence and the weight of the argument. And we have to do this knowing that we can be, in fact, wrong, that we can become convinced of things, and that we may have good, compelling arguments and reasons for it, and ultimately the thing we're convinced of is not true. Once upon a time, there were good reasons to believe that the sun went around the earth. Really good reasons to believe it. I'm
just going to interrupt this for a second because I want to see your opinions on this initial approach. Is what he's doing here is he's basically saying we need good reasons to believe something. And he is saying that basically he's making a claim that IP has not given him the good reasons. That's my assumption of where he's going. Would you say that's fair?
Or well,
Yes.
it seemed like what he was getting at was this whole thing about you see, IP did what William Lane Craig and others do in their discussions a lot of times, where after they're done, like William Lane Craig used to use this thing where he would say, and if my opponent wants to beat me, or I don't remember the exact verbiage, but he said something like, then they must first tear down all of my arguments against or for my position, and then erect a case of their own in its place in order to defeat my argument, for example. And IP said something like that. So I think Matt was getting at like, well, what IP said was basically that I need to show that the butler didn't do it and then like propose a hypothesis of my own. And I don't have to do that. All I have to do is show that what you presented is not necessarily the case. But I do think there's problems with that because, it's the same thing with like when I debated Tom Jump on the definition of atheism. It's that if I say let's take two hypotheses, or let's take a hypothesis like okay, the question is what the proposition is that something caused the universe, or whatever exists is contingent upon whatever created the universe or whatever. And then I say, well, how about this hypothesis, God? And then the other side either says, no, not good enough for me, or I can prove that it's not God. But regardless, the answer, the question then is, well, then what is the alternative hypothesis. And it seems like what Matt's saying and what I've heard from a lot of people is well, we don't actually have to have another hypothesis. We just got to say that yours doesn't work for us. And so in that way, I mean, I can see why IP and Craig use that argument, is to say like, well, you know, even if you could take my argument and say that it doesn't quite work, you still need to give a you know, competing hypothesis, right?
That's what I would think. And I want to say, Travis Lee is asking you a question, Converse. He says, question for Converse. If an atheist rejects the theist claims, does he need to offer a better explanation of why atheism better fits the data?
So that's kind of,
Sometimes.
yeah. So that's what I was kind of getting at is, if an atheist rejects theist claims, right? I'm looking at it as if it's a competing hypothesis, right? What is the nature of reality? Is it an atheistic universe or a theistic universe? And if it's a theistic universe, then you know, we want to give an argument for theism. It may be the case that all the arguments aren't great for theism, right? But that it still is the case. Now, even if you don't accept the arguments, that's kind of what I was saying, is like, you want to, like, so let's say we have an experiment, and I say like, we're doing a scientific experiment. Like I remember when I was younger, we did this thing with these CO2 cartridges and we were racing these little cars, and it was like, why do you think this one went further than the other one? And then, you know, you might have a hypothesis like, well, it went further because the wheels on it were, you know, they had a, you know, for the velocity of it, they had a better size or whatever. And then if somebody disagreed with that, they didn't just go, well, I don't buy that, and then go, that's it, I just don't buy it. No,
That's a great point. They have to
yeah,
say, well, no, I think it's the weight or something
right.
else.
They typically, exactly. They typically go, no, I don't think it was the wheels. I think that rather it seemed like it was the weight of one car or the other, or some alternative hypothesis that just explains the data. Because, you know, like I say, it's about explaining what we know.
Right. In this
Yeah.
particular case, IP is actually making a presentation, and he's saying in this presentation, he's saying basically, here's why the butler did it. I think the butler did it. It's not actually enough for Matt Dillahunty to just go, I really don't think that this shows that the butler did it. He's got to debunk specific reasons. So there's people in the chat that I noticed who are more versed in physics, who are arguing some of the specific points. Like somebody pointed out to me on Monday to check out the deconversion, I think it's called, or whatever. See, I'm not versed enough to be able to debunk or bolster his case. I don't know quantum physics well enough to talk fluently, but
Maybe
people who do,
decoherence.
decoherence. Yeah, thank you. Somebody said,
Right.
check out decoherence, and this is why it implies that. And I wasn't grounded enough to say, you know, you're mistaken. But he's arguing against the case that IP has presented. So IP is presenting a case, and you do owe it to IP to say it's not good enough because, okay, first, and Matt Dillahunty can do it. I've seen him argue against the irreducibility of consciousness. I've seen him. So he could have tried to do that with, I forget if he does in this debate, maybe he doesn't. But you can start arguing, okay, consciousness isn't irreducible, and here's why. You kind of can't just say this isn't good enough. You can for a little while, but then if we make the case strong enough using this particular argument, eventually you can't. You're going to have to come up with a better explanation, or, you know, give me your tithes. God is real. Give me the tithes. You know what I'm saying?
I think Matt could have gone to IP's channel and watched these kind of videos, because everyone was predicting he was going to do some sort of scientific arguments.
He didn't, though.
And no, it doesn't sound like he did. And so
yeah, but that doesn't make, why wouldn't he?
Well,
that doesn't make sense. Go
Well,
ahead.
maybe I'll say one more thing about this. You know, I've heard a lot lately that about the new atheist, and I should say I've heard this claim a lot lately that, and I'm sure you've probably heard it as well, that well, new atheist, right? There's nothing new about them, right? It's just same old atheism. It's just kind of, you know, kind of popularized or something now. Well, what I see to be the new thing about the new atheist is that they do have this kind of lack belief thing going on. And if, like, my favorite writers, like the existentialist writers that were atheists, like Friedrich Nietzsche, Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, like these guys, they really struggled and contended with these things existentially, and they actually
Totally.
yeah,
Totally.
like they would give arguments against God, and like Nietzsche, he got to the point where he said God is dead. Like he would give not only arguments for God, but then he would wrestle with the fact that if there is no God, and I take that actually serious, there are
Right.
some implications
Totally.
that are gonna necessarily be bad. But what I was getting at with that is that you know a lot of atheist philosophers. It's like I was listening to Josh Rasmussen the other day, and he said he doesn't know any, like he's obviously a philosopher. He said he doesn't know any professional atheist philosophers that say that there is no evidence for God. And I thought, wow, that's a cool claim. He said, but it's just, it's typically more that they think the evidence against outweighs. So if this is a philosophy discussion, for example, one might say, yeah, I mean, I can see where you're coming from with that. Maybe that does lend some credibility to the claim, but it doesn't work for me. And then there are some other things that outweigh it, like, for example, and then give some examples of why their hypothesis might be the correct way to look at it. So I just think that's a better approach, obviously.
Well, and you're totally right that like Camus and Nietzsche in particular, they weren't just atheists. They looked deeply at the actual philosophical implications of atheism. Camus in particular, the myth of Sisyphus, that's what that whole book is wrestling with. And how do you have anything other than despair? And that's where he came up with life is absurd. And that's where all absurdist theory came out of, because there are real philosophical implications if there is no God. And those guys looked it squarely in the face. But, they don't do that nowadays. They say that there isn't. So I agree with what he just said. Go ahead.
You say you present evidence for God, and they say they don't believe you, and that's pretty much where it ends.
Right.
So, all right, here we go.
He saw this and experienced it. Everybody who stood outside said, "Yep, there goes the sun." It's a direct observation, and the application of Occam's razor to a more parsimonious explanation would obviously have been that the sun goes around the earth. And if you asked me now or asked me then, hey, are there good reasons to believe the sun goes around the earth? I would say, yes, there are. And yet we have better reasons to understand now that perception is because of the earth spinning on its axis, assuming you're not a flat earther. The thing is, at different times, you can have good reasons to reach a conclusion, and that's independent of whether or not the conclusion you've reached is actually correct. And so when we hear certain claims in realms that we cannot properly investigate, it is almost obvious and I'm not going to come up with the right word for it. It seems reasonable that our intuitions about it are likely to be correct. If you go to a psychic reader and they lay out their tarot cards and they do a reading for you and it seems to apply to you, if you don't have any other information and you've been told that these people have some power to do this, then that is currently the best explanation that you have for it. This is true. This is what magicians exploit, and this is why magicians often went after the psychic readers and everything else, because they figured out, hey, these people appear to be doing this.
Sorry.
Let me just say this really quick, because this is hilarious. That's really, really brilliant sleight of hand. He just presented an argument from quantum mechanics and physics, and Matt Dillahunty, in his rebuttal, compares it. He starts comparing it to you're at a tarot card reading.
Right.
And, they do that stuff all the time. This was an argument from physics. You got to kind of deal with the argument. You can't just say, well, he just said woo, and that's the end of it. So go ahead. I mean, he compared it to tarot card readings. That's what he's doing right now.
He says, he's talking about flat earthers. I mean, he's trying to, then he says he can't, because these are in realms that we can't investigate. We can't go way down deep into the universe and try to figure out exactly what happened, but we certainly can. I mean, there are.
Yeah, that's exactly what physics is doing. That's exactly what they're doing.
That's what Sarah Salviander does. That's what Hugh Ross does. That's what a lot of people do who investigate the universe. They look out, and Albert Einstein, they look out, they make measurements, they look through the Hubble telescopes, and they do things like that, and they figure out what's going on in the universe. And the Salida experiment, like I mentioned, that's been duplicated numerous times by physicists trying to figure out what's going on here. Why does it seem like an observer changes the outcomes in this particular experiment of particles and waves?
Yeah,
Right,
and I guess
and it's counterintuitive.
Yeah, I guess to
Go
give Matt his credit where it's due. Like, I agree with you guys. Like, it did seem like he was comparing the physics argument to a tarot card reading, but one of the points that he made in there, because he's kind of switched the point from I don't have to give an alternative hypothesis to well, sometimes we have evidence for things, but it's not actually good at, like, even if it's like we have evidence for it, it may be the case that we're just looking at it the wrong way, or we're interpreting it the wrong way, or something like that. So like in that, I can see his, like, he's got, maybe a fair point there. But when he went to the tarot card example, I just thought, wow, yeah, I thought what Craig thought as well. It just didn't seem like he was interacting with a parallel one-to-one correlation
Right. I mean, he was
analogy.
IP was quoting physicists. He's saying, well, if you're going to consult Deepak Chopra and Mariana Williamson, then you'll believe anything. He's quoting physicists and actual physics. And they do this a lot of times. These arguments from the atheists come up automatically. They automatically route, philosophy or science back to woo, and that's woo artistry, and they compare it always to that. I don't think he's doing it consciously. I think that's how they hear all this stuff.
I see, when I picture tarot cards, I picture these. I've seen I've seen these funny shows where they'll have like a lady who's supposed to be reading somebody's or making predictions using tarot cards or using a magic crystal or something like that. And what they do is in the TV show, the lady will be stealing the person's purse, going through the wallet. Oh, do you live on this street? It's just completely fake,
Yeah.
So I think it's funny that, it's kind of funny because that's the impression I get. That's what I think of when I think of tarot cards and crystal balls and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, there's a history there. You guys may not be familiar, I'm not sure, but there's actually a history of atheists in magic and in breaking down some of the claims of like tarot card readers and things like that. Specifically Darren, I think it's Darren Brown from the UK. And I think maybe I've noticed before that when I watched a lot of Darren Brown has like this big show in the UK, or at least he used to. He's had multiple shows, but he's a really popular atheist, illusionist, magician. He deals with NLP, neuro linguistic programming, and he does a lot of these like busting tarot card readers and things like that. But I just thought I'd mention that, it seems like a lot of times I have heard some of Matt Dillahunty's examples and things like that, and thought this sounds just like Darren Brown's show. So there could be some like significance there. Like maybe he's using the examples that he's familiar with, and maybe it's not, like Craig said, maybe it's not a conscious thing. It's just how he like views these things. So, but anyway.
Yeah, because I've heard he said he's a magician, or he's done some magic tricks.
Right.
He is a magician. He does a
magic show. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's interesting.
But he
okay,
automatically okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right, here we go.
The same tricks that I'm doing in my show, only they're claiming that it's a supernatural thing. The reason we're able to debunk that to whatever extent we are is because we have found the thing that you're looking for, which is here's a better explanation. And so did you in fact have good reason to believe that the psychic was communicating with, the dead?
See, what did that have anything to do with his argument?
Well, it's interesting. What's really interesting is the most interesting thing about what he just said is that, how we know that was wrong is because we found the alternative hypothesis that was better. And it's like, well, didn't you just say, like, I don't need to give an alternative hypothesis? So it just seemed to me that that's what he just argued there was, how we know that the tarot card reader was wrong? Because we found the better explanation. So, well, good. Give us the better explanation to the digital physics argument.
Yeah, we're looking for the digital physics argument and the mind over matter and the consciousness thing. And he switches it over to, now we're talking about tarot cards and people talking to the dead. And it's like,
IP should do this argument with
IP bring up talking to the dead.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's sleight of hand. You switch the parameters of the debate to more fertile territory for you to debunk. I mean, and you debunk and dismiss, discredit. Now you're arguing against tarot card readers, and everyone in the audience is like, "Yeah, tarot card readers are so dumb," and they don't realize you just compared IP's argument from physicists to tarot card readers, and it's,
you know,
it's actually what magicians do: sleight of hand. So pay no attention to that. Go ahead.
This was an approach because he took IP's very high level arguments and he brought them down to earth, and all the laymen in the audience who don't really understand what IP was talking about are like, yeah, I can agree with that. Yeah, tarot card readers. Yeah, that's just
Right.
wrong.
Right.
That's a good point.
He did the same thing when the guy called on the show at Atheist Experience. This guy presented himself as an agnostic. And he says, don't you think there could be something more bigger than this world? And they did the same thing. They took him down as if he was speaking the most outlandish woo they ever heard in their life, like metaphysical speculations, just out of bounds. It's
Yeah, I heard
crazy,
your.
no matter what.
I heard your
video too on that.
Yeah,
That
that
was
was very.
good.
That's what I was talking about.
Craig.
I'm gonna do
Yeah.
that one again because there's more to that story.
Your
there's
video
a lot.
was very
interesting.
funny.
Yeah, I always get a
Forgot
kick out of his stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
like
gonna
his-
make sure if you're in the audience now, make sure you go to Craig and Converse Contenders channels. I've got links to them in the description, and go ahead and subscribe if they'd like that. So they're trying to build their channels up. And so am I.
Yes.
So please subscribe if you're here and you haven't yet. So, all right, you ready to go to more?
Yeah, go
Here
for
we
it.
go.
Perhaps. But if the case is essentially, I can't come up with any other explanation, we know that in and of itself is not a good reason. It's not a compelling reason to believe things. This is how we've come to virtually every wrong belief that we've come to, is our intuitions, our biases lead us towards a good conclusion. And so if we're going to talk about whether or not there are good reasons to believe something, the first thing we have to do is figure out, what do we mean by good reasons? If we look at something and we make observations and we do our best to remove as much of our individual bias as we can, and we come up with a collection of data, and we can put together a model that currently explains the data, then that would certainly be considered the current best explanation for that data. But whether or not you have a good reason to believe a particular explanation is also dependent on whether or not the thing that you're explaining is, or the explanation you're coming up with, is something that you can investigate and explore. Because if you try to solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery, you haven't done anything. And if you try to solve a mystery by just labeling it something, I don't know that you've actually bothered to explain anything. And so if we...
You see what he's doing is he's giving people these cognitive shortcuts. So what he's doing, hey, you can't solve a mystery by appealing to another mystery. Or
Sloganeering.
Yeah, so
Right.
He's
But
trying
We
to
talked about those.
He's trying to give cognitive shortcuts or heuristics to people so that you can remember when you leave the debate. Oh yeah, I can't solve a mystery with another mystery.
Right,
Yeah,
but he also
we actually talked about that last week. Last time we had the discussion, we mentioned the sloganeering.
yeah. But he said
Yeah.
you gotta examine the data and come up with the best possible explanation. Well, that's the presentation that IP just made. Here's the data. Here's what the physicists say. And here's what I'm arguing is the best possible explanation, interpretation of the data and the physics. And he's saying, well, you can't just come up with any old explanation. It's got to be the best explanation possible for the data. That's
Yeah,
what
I
they
mean,
did, dude.
but if you think about it, like you could ask a question like, well, why is there a piece of paper, a balled up piece of paper right here on the ground? And then you can go like, well, there's this a tornado threw it over here, and you're like, well, okay, well, now I can understand this simple thing, the piece of paper, how it got here, but like, what's a tornado? And it's like this, because there's always this claim that you can't, that you have to have something super simple or unmysterious to be the explanation of something. It's not necessarily the case. I mean, if you look at a book that was written by a person, you might say, well, what's the cause of the book? And you say, oh, a personal agent. And then you break down like, well, what is a personal agent? It's like, that's full of mystery. I mean, think about like, how does first and second order beliefs work? How does their mind work? How does consciousness play a role in their self-reflection and their ideas, the prose and the poetry? I mean, there is like a huge mystery around like the human mind and things like that. And you're like, so you're going to explain something like a simple book by appealing to something so mysterious as the human conscious psyche and like all, well, sure. Like that doesn't, that's not necessarily a principle that cannot be like that can't be broken or something.
Yeah, no, I agree. Craig, did you want to
Totally.
comment?
No, I agree. Totally.
Okay, let's go. Let's go to this. Here we go.
We look around at the universe and we say, what would we have to do to try to make sure that we're coming up with good reasons or the best reasons, or that our internal model of reality is as accurate as it can be, then one of the key things is to remove any biases we have, to operate, the veil of ignorance is something that I've referenced quite often with regard to morality and other things, but this same sort of thought experiment applies to any other question. And if you come across somebody who's hanging by the neck from a rope, if that's all you're told, your intuition is going to be, they either committed suicide or somebody hung them, whatever. But that's because we don't think about the possibility of an accident and the fact that we haven't been given enough information. It's entirely possible, as somebody who served in the Navy, I can tell you that a bight of rope laying loose that gets tugged could cause an accident where somebody ends up hanging from the neck. So the next thing we want to do is we look at and investigate the rope. Was this rope tied in a knot? Was it secured? Is it a special knot for this? And you continue going down that line to collect as much information as you can. If you just start at the initial observation and say, how best can we explain this? Of course, you're going to get to the notion that, consciousness must come from a mind or anything along those lines, because you don't yet have enough information. And so I don't know why we would, go to a bunch of physicists to have them start doing philosophy for us. I mean, that seems a bit strange. Here's a bunch of physicists who say that philosophically speaking, it should be this. I'd rather, I don't know, I would say I'd rather go to the philosophers. However, that's potentially just as much of a mess as anything. Because if you have something that appears mysterious and you don't have a solution for it, you have to work to demonstrate that not only here's a solution, but here's a probable solution. And probability is something that you don't necessarily have to actually calculate, but you should be able to at least approximate. And you can't say that X is more probable merely because it hasn't been disproven or merely because somebody hasn't come up with a better explanation, because it's more probable than what? It's more probable than no explanation.
I'm not even sure what he's doing here. I have to say, it sounds like kind of a gish gallop a little bit. I mean, he's kind of all over the place. He's saying, okay, well, we want to remove biases. Okay, yeah, we can agree to that. Or we want to collect as much information as possible. And if we do collect information, we want to get it from physicists. However, not physicists who are doing some philosophy on the side. We can't have physicists doing philosophy. Let's go to the philosophers. Oh, let's not go to the philosophers. Instead of going to the philosophers, let's go back to the physicists. And then he says, we're going to conduct probability. And when we do probability assessments, we're going to look at how much, how much probability we can expect. I mean, it just seems like he's all over the place, but he's not addressing any of IP's points.
It's borderline terrible. I agree. It's because he's used to arguing these things a certain way. And it's the same thing that happened when the guy called up. When it's presented in rationalist terms where science and data are backing IP stripped it down to the least amount of supernatural in his presentation. And when people start doing that, he struggles because most of his rebuttals are, he's been practicing it for years on people who are presenting outlandish claims. So when people start making the claims more down to earth and rooted in science and rooted in fact, he struggles to plug his same sort of rebuttals in, and it doesn't quite make any sense. Yeah, this rebuttal is borderline terrible. It's borderline terrible.
Yes, so
I agree. At least this little part of it.
What I would say is okay, so just a few things here. I agree with you on that, SJ. I feel like he is kind of jumping around a lot, but just to give him credit, I'll just say that maybe he didn't prepare for the scientific aspect, so he's trying to explain his thoughts, and I'll try to be charitable about that. But by the off chance that he watches this, I'm sure you guys agree, appreciate your service in the military, of course, because he just mentioned that he was in the Navy. And I took his example about the rope. I can take that example and partially agree with him by saying, he said something like, well, yeah, but if there's a piece of rope or something, then, and somebody's hanging by their neck from a rope, you could say that somebody hung them, or for example, in the Navy, there could have been some accident to where somebody's hanging from their neck. But then you would look at the details to see, is it tied in a specific knot, or what are the, specifics? And well, I mean, I can agree with all of that, but I would just say that the only person that's given any specifics was IP. So like I'd have to, not knowing much about this argument, like if I'm just, somebody listening in, I'm going to have to go with the person that gave any specifics. And then the last thing I want to say was that there's a very kind person in the audience named Sarah. She goes by something different though. Something like stupid
Oh,
energy.
I see. Yeah, I see her.
I'm
Yeah,
just
she's-
kidding.
I
I'm
like
just messing around. Yeah, I did too. I'm just joking. No, but she says that it's better to stick with Occam's razor when we see because we see humans write books, responding to my last point. And I can agree with that. But what I would say is that Occam's razor, it says limit. It doesn't just say limit things to the most simple. It says limit them to necessity. So it's limit things to what is necessary to explain it. A lot of people use this in the wrong way to try and say that it means simplicity. But what it actually is saying is you actually have to have something that's a sufficient explanation though. You can't just have something simple and explain it. If you find something simple that can explain part of it, but that's not a sufficient explanation. So, so I can partially agree with you, but I would just say that, a person is a sufficient explanation for a book, right? So, and that, I think that's what IP is kind of arguing, is that God would be a sufficient explanation for these factors of what we know about the digital physics there.
Also, Occam's razor isn't a rule, right? It's just a general principle. There's nothing that says it's all forever and always true in all situations.
Well,
it's just a general principle of inference.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it just says like you want
the
to
most
limit.
parsimonious explanation.
Right, exactly. You want to limit your explanations to necessity. So, like for example, if I were to say what created the universe, and you said, well, there were let's say one alien created it, and then another alien created that one, and another one created that one. It's like, well, just go back to what created everything, and it's like, oh, well, there was a God that created everything.
Oh, okay.
It's like, well, that makes sense. It's a sufficient cause, and it limits the explanation to necessity.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Okay, here we go.
Well, that is not, if we don't know anything about who killed the person, the butler is a more probable explanation than nobody did it. But the people who are not convinced that the butler is guilty are not saying nobody did it. They're saying we don't know who did it. You may have enough evidence to make it a compelling case that this was a murder, but you haven't come up with, a compelling case for who actually did it. So the explanation that we come up with needs to be unique to the claim. Our explanation shouldn't be able to justify multiple competing claims, which is why, no offense here, but when you argue for the classical God as opposed to a specific God, I really don't think that it gets us anywhere, because at most, even if I conceded everything and said that, if you're just going to define God as that which serves as a foundation for the universe, then you've defined God in a way that doesn't have any of the properties of anything that people are going to, or any unique properties of what people have classically identified as God. It doesn't have to be, a personal being or all powerful or anything else that would get you to a particular one. And if, Christians and Muslims and Hindus and everybody else can use the same case of, there must be some mind at the end of it, that doesn't get us anywhere near an understanding of what that means. And so while I'll save a good chunk of that for actually going through the rebuttal, when we have a claim, a mystery, acknowledging, this is a hard problem is good. But it's not, I'm not here to defend materialism in the sense of philosophical materialism. I'm not even claiming that there is in fact an explanation for this. So when we look at, for example, the origin of the universe or the origin of consciousness, it may be enough to say, we don't know. This is an unsolved problem. And then people come in and say, yes, but we have this and this and this, and here's this in quantum physics, and it appears that observations, will help the waveform collapse, and so there must be a conscious observer, except that we also have other experiments that show that there's not necessarily a conscious observer when you're doing the double slit experiment. The measurement happens at the time that it's going through the slit, not when the scientist comes in and looks at what the results are. Now, even if there is seemingly good evidence that somehow consciousness is collapsing it, you have no mechanism by which you can say that this is the case. And this appears to be a good chunk of the arguments that are being presented both here and elsewhere. So if we're going to say, are there good reasons to believe in a God? Well, we could go down an entirely subjective route and say that I'm convinced and I think these reasons are good and they're good enough for me, and therefore I'm just going to call them good reasons. But then we run into that problem where we know that there are people who think that they have good reasons, and it's just that they don't have enough information. At one time, it may have been all of humanity that didn't have enough information about whether or not the sun orbits the Earth or the Earth orbits the sun, and they had a flawed perspective on it. They still had a good reason. The question then becomes, have we graduated to a point where even on questions where we don't have an answer, that what would at first blush appear to be good reasons to reach a conclusion are in fact not good reasons because of other things we know? Do we have to have a counter explanation that we then show is more plausible? Because more plausible or more probable doesn't tell us much. What if the probability that classical God is the correct explanation is 1%, and we come up with something that's 6%? We still don't have any good reason to think that we are beyond the, let's say, 50 point whatever percent to get us to something that, yes, this is worth reasonably concluding for now. And the thing that people don't often remember is that science often gets pointed to as the best of all these. It is the scientific methods are the single most consistently reliable way we have of understanding the universe. But science doesn't make proclamations about truth. It creates probabilistic models based on what we understand. It explains things in terms of other things that we understand. And when we are at the fledgling front of some scientific disciplines that to many are going to appear as almost identical or indistinguishable from magic. When we're, I know we didn't get into string theory stuff here, but it raises the question of, is this proposition falsifiable? And just by example, without going too much into rebuttal at the outset, the fact that we can make a simulation of something, I don't see how that could ever lead someone to the conclusion that therefore the something we are simulating is also likely or more probably a simulation itself. The fact that, because what we're doing when we simulate something is essentially we're describing it in an abstract way in some other language, in some other environment. We're creating a computer model of it. We're creating a model of it in our head. And to say that because I can create this model in my head or I can simulate it in a computer, perhaps the thing, it reminds me of, and I don't mean to dismiss it this way, it just comes into my head this way. The scene in Animal House where they're all high and they're talking about, what if we're all part of the universe on a fingernail? It's a cool idea. The notion that we might be living in a simulation is interesting. I've seen some models that suggest that the processing power of it would become, especially for a dynamic universe, would become exponentially prohibited. But none of those arguments will fly either, because those are based on the physics and understanding that we have in our, let's say, simulation. And so what can you tell about the world outside of the simulation? All of these problems where we seem to reach a limit in our ability to explore, to investigate, and to understand, my view is, I don't know what the explanation is. I don't even know how you could say what is more probable as an explanation. And the best thing we can do, seemingly, is to argue by analogy, which, when we've done that in the past, when we have made these claims that this is the best explanation that we have based on our current understanding, at any time later where we've found out what the actual explanation is, we found out that we probably were wrong. We're constantly being wrong, which is why all of science is this tentative proclamation about a likely model based on evidence, and not this is the truth or this is the absolute truth. Like, I don't think we can get to absolute certainty on anything. And so I wouldn't be expecting you to get to absolute certainty on anything. But to say that we have good reasons, a real argument could be made that we can have good reasons for anything if we go down this, I have limited knowledge and I have this subjective experience. If we're going to talk about whether or not we have good reasons to think that our answer is likely, not that it is the best of the potential candidate explanations right now, but that it is actually likely true, that is a different bar. And that is the bar that I'm kind of holding to, which is, If we have no explanation, any explanation anybody offers that isn't falsifiable would seem like a better explanation. But does it rise to the level of being an actual good explanation? Is it sufficient to explain this? And do we have good reason to think that it is likely or probable? Or are we just saying, hey, this is weird. I don't know how we could possibly explain the mind or the origin of the universe, but people have proposed this idea that there's a being that is not bound by space and time, that is immensely powerful and reasonable and wonderful and awe-inspiring. And of course, that being could do that. That being could serve as a ground for this. And because we don't have another explanation, that being is necessarily more probable than a non-explanation, and therefore I have good reasons to believe it. And I don't see how that rises beyond, this feels better to me than not having an explanation. If in fact, the truth is, we don't have the most likely explanation. I don't know how to tell the difference between those two.
Good vote.
Okay, so I think that's probably going to be about the part we'll review today, as far as this kind of thing. But I wanted to say, go back to you guys. So what's your take on his final part of that argument?
Well, he debunked the ontological argument, not the digital physics argument that was just presented to him. I kind of feel for him, but he should have watched IP's videos. I mean, the videos are there and this argument is in there, and he didn't really go check, but he didn't really address anything that IP said in his digital physics argument. The atheists who are offering counter arguments are offering counter arguments on the physics. They're saying, well, that's not a good explanation because of XYZ. He just kind of debunked, he just kind of made these general standard issue debunkings of theist speak that have nothing to do with the actual argument presented, at least as far as I saw. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I guess my reaction to what he last said was, I agreed with part of it, right? I mean, I agreed with, and I almost feel like I should totally disagree just based off principle, because the other day Dragnot was talking about different approaches, and he talked about hog tie and different people, and then he mentioned me, and he was like, yeah, so Converse typically like will say one good thing about somebody and then like say where they're wrong about something, and then he thinks I'm doing it to try to even out. But it's like I told him, I was like, I like to give credit where credit's due, Like, I mean, I guess I could just be all against somebody and be like, no, he's just 100% wrong. He's obviously trying to mix IP up. But like, yeah, see, I can understand some of his things. He's like, well, if some evidence makes something more probable, it could still be wrong. And the evidence that we have makes this a more probable option, right? Or more likely option. And so I can agree with that partially, right? But science does typically go with the more probable option. Science typically goes with the model that explains more. It's not just about, there are multiple criteria. Like does it have explanatory scope? Does it have explanatory power? Like how much does it actually explain? Does it explain one facet of it and you can extrapolate from there? Or is there, but he ended with the more humble approach where he said, how do we determine these probabilities and how do we know? And he goes, I don't know the answer to that. So I guess in that way, I could give him that credit and just say that like, he said he wasn't sure. But again, atheists don't typically like it when we argue from, when we give examples to show how they could be wrong about something. And then we go, but I don't know. But here's a case where it shows that you could be wrong about it. And then they typically go, oh, so you're going to deny this part of science because of it could be wrong. And I'm like, well, it just seems to me that that's what Matt's doing here. But, at least he admitted his ignorance at the end.
Yeah, well, he had a lot of one of the things that gives atheists a hard time is because when they look at things like origin, meaning, morality, objective morality, purpose, there's all these big questions that are out there, and I think that when we start looking into those, and then we say, okay, let's try to explain our origins. Let's look into evolution. A lot of the, or let's look into the cosmology or the Big Bang theory and that kind of thing. And I can see why when you mentioned in 1925 when the Big Bang theory was posited, why a lot of atheists had. Were probably uncomfortable with that, including Einstein. I think Einstein, it's argued that he's an agnostic or he was a deist or something like that. But there's an argument on they were uncomfortable because they said, well, if there was a beginning, then what came, what powered the universe, what inflated the universe, and at this starting point. And so that was something that I think there was a lot of issues with. And so to just say, I don't know, to always answer everything with, I don't know, that's always been something that I get kind of frustrated by. But on the counter of that, I can see their point where they're saying, well, you're just trying to find an explanation and your explanation is based on limited data. I think that was one of what Matt's arguments is. He's saying we don't have enough data to make propositions about the universe or God. Therefore, we shouldn't do anything. We should just sort of shrug our shoulders and say, we're not there yet.
Well, right. See, most of the time when Matt uses those standard objections, those atheist objections, they work and they make sense because the Christian is overshooting the mark and making a big faith claim based on limited data. Just like Aaron Ra will say you 1,000 times a day, you believe something without evidence. But in this particular argument, he's making a much more limited claim based on the data from the physicists. So the standard objection doesn't quite work. Well, it's one thing to just say, I don't know, therefore, Magic Man in the Sky did. Well, that's not what he was saying. He's saying there are mind-like qualities to the universe, and the physicists have been arguing this for 30 to 50 years. And those mind-like, there's no good reason to think that the mind-like qualities of the universe don't indicate, a cosmic consciousness. That's kind of sort of the general argument that he's making. It's not a really big, exaggerated, Jesus rose from the dead. The Bible says it.
Yeah, and I'm fine with I'm fine with I don't know for some specific examples, right? But I just feel like people do know what they believe deep down, and that they do make choices based on what they believe. Like take for example agnosticism, which I think is a more I think it's a more humble position than atheism. But it seems to be that the claim in agnosticism is, well, I don't have a clue. Like I'll wait till the data comes in. But like in life, you have to make choices. You have to, should I marry this person? Well, I mean, I've got some evidence, but like, I don't know if they're going to be a great person to marry. But like, at some point, you got to choose something and then make a decision. Now, not on all things, right? But there are instances where you do have to take that leap of faith and go based on the evidence which you have, right? And so
totally.
Yeah, and you're about to do that.
Right, exactly. So the only point I was really making is like, I'm fine with I don't know as an answer sometimes, right? But like, I feel like Matt does have a model of reality. I feel like he does believe things that he thinks are true, but when he gets into these discussions that he don't want to put them on the line because maybe he doesn't know this specific argument that well. So, I mean, that's just my thoughts on that.
Well, you definitely take leaps of faith in life all the time. And, that's like I was saying in one of my videos, Richard Dawkins will say, faith is believing without evidence. Richard Dawkins wrote a book. Once you're a writer, you have evidence that people are going to read your book. But a book, the first time you write a book, it's by definition a leap of faith. There's no evidence that anybody's going to read your book, it'll be published, that anybody's going to care what you think. So you take leaps of faith in life all the time.
It's true.
Forward momentum requires a leap of faith half the time. Taking this, marrying this person or whatever, just like you said. So
yeah,
yes.
And Travis Lee pointed out in there's to some extent, it could be an argument from ignorance, a little bit on the atheist side. He says,
and yes, absolutely.
What else could it be? It must be that kind of thing. So That's okay. Well, I think what we're at 8 o'clock right now. We've gone an hour and a half. I think that's probably a pretty good deal. In an hour on the modern day debate, we're going to see Converse Contender as the moderator. So everyone might want to come back over to the modern day debate. I've also got a link to his channel in my description. And so you might want to be sure to go over there and watch Converse Contender. They're going to be debating a topic. Is porn good? I think that's what is it called?
Yeah, so I posted the link to it on my Twitter, and basically there's going to be 3 people debating, so it's going to be a 3-way on is porn bad for, I think is porn bad for society?
And
And so
absolutely, yes, it's horrible.
you'll have Praise debating on the side saying yes. You'll have some guy that I'm unfamiliar with named Steve that's going to take the position that he's on the fence, and you'll have Phil Bunny, who was on my channel on the after show last night. That's an interesting conversation as well, but he'll be taking the position that it's fine. So.
You know, I hope that faith or Praise brings in some of the facts on porn, because I've seen some numbers that it's crazy the amount of time people spend on porn pages and that kind of thing. It's in the amount of money that's spent on it. It's actually really sick. I mean, I think people have I mean, I don't want to say, I'm sorry, this isn't just being because I'm a Christian. This is because I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm someone who values students, and I think that too much porn can really ruin people. So.
Yeah, I actually said last night when we had the after show on my channel, I actually said in it, because we brought it up a little bit, and I said, even if you don't want to make a moral argument, you could make the type of argument that Jordan Peterson makes, where it's well, first of all, it destroys men's libido and their by constantly using their testosterone for different, and then also it makes it increases or it makes a standard for their wives that is unrealistic, right? But also it takes the desires of healthy sexual appetite and makes it into a I guess you could say more
transactional,
desirous. Yeah. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of
and it's addictive.
Sure.
Yeah, it takes away from relational and goes to transactional. And John Lloyd is saying, and women slaves, there are some women who are trapped in that industry.
Yeah, and actually, a psychologist that I used to listen to that pointed this out said that while addiction with like tobacco is one thing, and like drugs, but like our bodies don't naturally crave those things. But like with sex, the reason why it can be so addictive is because you naturally have like a yearning for things like that. So that can make it worse.
Yeah. Well, so this is going to be very interesting. So I recommend everybody goes over there. Also, if you just joined, be sure to go to the description and join, subscribe to their channels, to Craig Reed's channel and to Converse Contender's channel, because they're both listed in the description. And I want to say thank you to everybody who's come by. I see right now on the screen, this one guy, Travis Lee, 305 Thief, Cameron, Iger Television, Brian Stevens, Brenda. Earlier, I saw Steven Steen, and I saw Sarah and a few other people, Brenda, some other pretty neat people, John Lloyd. So thank you so much, everyone. It's been awesome. Did you guys want to make a couple closing comments, or just where people can find you? I know we can find you on your channels. I have that here, but.
Oh, I'm good.
Well, yeah,
Brian?
I mean, that's, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say that I want to get you guys on my channel. I got a discussion coming
definitely.
up.
Well, we can do a review on your channel too, if you want.
I definitely want to do that for sure, because I've been thinking about it over the last couple of weeks, and I'm like, I'm going on SJ's channel every week, but I want to get SJ on my channel.
You want to build yours? Well, why don't we rotate?
yeah,
Why don't we
also
rotate the 3 channels?
Just also because I like to have interesting people on, because I have maybe there's some people in my audience that maybe don't subscribe to you guys as well, and so I'd like to at least have the diversity of thought on there.
Well, you also had a debate with Alex Malpass and
oh yeah,
was a dry apologist. I only watched the first 20 minutes of that so far, but that looked like it was pretty interesting.
It was really interesting. I got a lot of good feedback from it. So, but yeah, so if you guys want, maybe next week or so, we might do this again on my channel. So
that sounds good. Yeah, I can't even talk. We'll rotate. We'll go around. So thank you everyone for coming in. I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. All right.
Thank you.
End it.